I wanted to make sure I got this in before Lee reads another book, so that you guys could get your follow-up show that I usually give you on Friday. And so particularly the book that Lee read on Wednesday that I want to talk a little bit about was called Me, Jane. And it's been so long since he read this book that it actually got taken back to the library, so I don't have it with me today, but you can go check it out at the library. I can tell you for a fact that it's there. And what Me, Jane was about was sort of the very early life of Jane Goodall, who is somebody who maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. She is a very famous biologist, primatologist, I guess, depending on what kind of ologist label you want to throw on her, who's been doing work in Africa with chimpanzees for 60 years going on at this point, probably, maybe more than that. Like I said, very, very famous scientist, but one who has at various times in her life been somewhat controversial for her research methods, but is broadly pretty well regarded by the scientific community, and is alive to this day. And like I said, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the things that she discovered with chimpanzees and sort of the effect that had on the broader scientific community, even outside of just studying modern day primatology. And so we're going to go back a little further, and we're going to talk sort of about the way that like paleoanthropology, biological anthropology, physical anthropology, whatever field you want to call this. It's a field that is very much about sort of the evolutionary history of humans. And so a big part of that field has ended up being sort of trying to quantify what it means to be a human. What do we say is a human? Where do we draw the line between human and not human? Is very much, part and parcel with what that field aims to do, what it studies. And so what I have around me here are a bunch of different skulls of a bunch of different animals that have all been deemed different species at various points in history. And what I think I want to talk a little bit about is sort of where they fit into this larger sort of puzzle as far as human evolutionary history, and particularly like why they got put there. In particular, we are going to talk first about these guys, these two. And so this one here is a Cro-Magnon skull, which is, again, a name you've probably heard before. It's the remains of a very early human, well, again, depends on what you call human, from France is where these remains were found. And these are probably 100 and some thousand years old, would be, I think, what Cro-Magnon ends up being at about. Relatively recent, like in the grander scheme of history. But these guys are some of the ones that are sort of considered to be some of the earliest, what we call anatomically modern humans, is what the textbooks that you'll read like in college refer to these guys as anatomically modern humans. And the general consensus is that anatomically modern humans become a thing sometime between like 200 and 250,000 years ago, is about where they're at with that. And again, the consensus is that this is a human. And you can even see it's got printed on the back. Maybe you can't see it just because the camera's where it's at. But it says Homo sapiens sapiens, which is the species that I am. I would be called a Homo sapiens sapien. You there listening at home, Homo sapiens sapiens would be the species that you would be considered too. So this is some of the earliest Homo sapiens sapiens. But I also have this guy next to me here, and this is a different, similar primate to humans. This is maybe 3 and change million years ago, and this is called Australopithecus africanus. And so the Australopithecus africanus is pretty broadly considered to be a direct ancestor to humans. And so somewhere along this line, from, like I said, maybe 3.5 million years ago to about, call it 200,000 years ago, we, as scientists, as humans, drew a line and said, this isn't a human. We're not putting this in genus Homo, but this is definitely human. In fact, this is even the same species as human. And there's a number of different things in between here, but at some point, somebody drew a line that says, hey, everything that is older than this, we're going to call an Australopithecus or a Paranthropus, depending on which individual you're referring to, and everything past this is closely enough related to us that we're going to say genus Homo. And what I want to talk a little bit about is how that was decided way back in the day, and how the decisions that were made then are kind of affecting some of this stuff that we're talking about now. So, for years and years and years and years, the kind of consensus, like, earliest species in genus Homo, the one that, like, was the very first one to, not the first one to get the genus Homo, but the earliest one to get the genus Homo, was called Homo Habilis. And I'm just going to do a quick check here on the timeline on that. I want to make sure I'm absolutely right here. So Homo Habilis exists a little more than 2 million years ago. So Homo Habilis is, you know, a little more than 1 million years after this guy, after Australopithecus africanus. And so Homo Habilis is a species that was put into genus Homo for pretty much one very specific reason, and that was because there was pretty substantial evidence that Homo Habilis was using tools. And so that was considered to be the big difference between the Australopithecines, these guys, and the ones that are genus Homo. Is the assumption was that Australopithecines did not use tools, but things in genus Homo did. And so being a thing that uses tools became sort of the defining feature for getting put in genus Homo, you know, getting put in this group that we sort of consider to be human. And this kind of plays into different talks I've done in the past about how sometimes in biology things get categorized less based on biology and more based on like behavioral or appearance stuff, and this becomes very true in like fossil stuff especially. And sometimes it doesn't always hold true, like to further inspection, and it causes problems. So, you know, we talked about how like the things we call toads, we tend to call toads because of like a certain appearance thing with the like lumpy backs, even though toads aren't any less related to other types of frog than like any other frog is. Like there's no reason as far as biological relation to refer to a thing as a toad rather than a frog, but we do it anyway. And so this was kind of that same situation where, you know, people looked at the Homo habilis remains versus like the like late stage Australopithecus remains, and there's not like anything super noticeable there to say, yep, this is definitively something different to the point that it belongs in a different genus even. But because the Homo habilis remains had evidence of tool use around them, they got put in a different genus. Cut to Jane Goodall. And Jane Goodall starts doing her work with chimpanzees out in Gombe, out in Tanzania, I think is where Gombe is, Tanzania. And one of the things that she observes relatively early on in her research is chimpanzees making and using tools. And like I said, up to that point, like the sole defining thing that separated humans from these other primates was tool use. Like that was the defining thing. And so now all of a sudden Jane Goodall comes up and she's saying, hey, these chimpanzees are definitely making and using tools. Now we have to come up, we have to do one of two things. We either have to say chimpanzees are human, or we have to come up with a new definition for human that includes the stuff we want to call human, but excludes the stuff that we don't. I'll also, just for the sake of kind of clumping our stuff together here, the stuff on this side of the line is all part of genus Homo. So this is Homo sapiens sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, depending on, I guess, what verbiage you want to use. This would be Homo erectus pekinensis or Sinanthropus pekinensis, but typically now it's Homo erectus pekinensis, whatever. Nowadays, Homo erectus pekinensis is usually what this is referred to as. But all this stuff over here is not considered to be a part of genus Homo. And so the thing that particularly Jane Goodall's research really brought to light or highlighted was, like I said, we had this like behavioral thing that we were using to define humanity, and it turned out that that behavioral thing wasn't nearly so exclusive to the things we wanted to call human as we thought it was. And so, like I said, now you're forced to reconcile, like, okay, how do we decide what's human or not? And this is honestly a debate that has been going on for decades since. Like I said, Jane Goodall was doing her research. This was like one of her first like publications out there in Gombe, and you know, it's like back in the 60s. It's like 65 or something like that is when she first like writes that paper. And like I said, people are still arguing about it. Homo habilis is still a species that is like tremendously controversial in the kind of paleoarchaeology sphere, like whether Homo habilis really has any reason to be considered part of genus Homo. Because as it's also come out that a lot of the stuff that we were calling Australopithecines were also using tools. And so, like I said, the initial thing that got Homo habilis into genus Homo doesn't really make any sense anymore. And so if that was a species that was discovered now, they probably wouldn't put it in genus Homo anymore. They would probably call it an Australopithecus. But getting the names of these things changed is hard, and there's obviously a lot of people who have a lot of their like personal legacies tied up into this. Like something that gets found that gets put in genus Homo is viewed as like a really important thing. It's viewed as something that is, you know, career defining. If you can, you know, find a new species that gets put in genus Homo, like that's huge. Like finding a new Australopithecus is huge too, but finding a genus Homo thing is like you're known like throughout the biological anthropology world if you do that. And so, like I said, people's legacies get tied up into it. It gets very politicized. It's a great example of a time where human interests and human wants sometimes can get in the way of what, you know, necessarily makes a whole lot of sense. Egos get involved and can hinder the progress, or I guess in this case it's not even necessarily progress. It's a bunch of nerds arguing about, you know, what we should name this thing. Like I said, it gets kind of very personal when it comes to human stuff, and particularly when it comes to things like apes, because some of this stuff still exists. I mean, these guys, this is extinct now. This has been dead for, you know, like I said, 3 million years at this point. But like these guys still exist. This is a chimpanzee and a gorilla, and you know, if there was to be like a broad scientific consensus that chimpanzees should get put into genus Homo, we probably treat them very different from a conservation point of view, because we're saying, hey, these things aren't some other ape. These things, you know, functionally are human. And so, like I said, by like the definition of human that they were using when they named a lot of these things, chimpanzees very well might be considered human if they were to go, you know, if they had been discovered and named in, you know, if the type of things that Jane Goodall was discovering as far as their tool use had been discovered earlier, like I said, it's very likely that we probably wouldn't have put them in genus Homo, but what we probably would have done is also not had Homo habilis be in genus Homo is the thing. And so yeah, it's a very interesting thing because like as far as like our most recent common ancestor stuff goes, chimpanzees, you're talking 5 and change million years ago. Whereas, like I said, some of the stuff that we're calling an Australopithecus, you know, Africanus is one of the more recent ones, but Australopithecus afarensis, like that goes back almost as far as the like human chimp divide. And so even, you know, going so far back as to say, you know, yeah, maybe both Australopithecines and genus Homo stuff uses tools. there's probably half an argument to be made that, like, you could put this could be Australopithecus troglodytes instead of Pan-troglodytes. And like I said, giving it even that designation, saying, this is, not genus Homo, not a human, but it is, such a close relative to humans that we put it in the same genus as our immediate ancestors, would probably make a difference as far as the rhetoric around him, as far as the conservation goes.
I think that once you get down to the nitty-gritty level of, like, how closely related, like, considering how closely related humans and, like, chimps are, it starts to show a little bit how taxonomy is a model that we impose on life. Mm-hmm. It's not like an inherent aspect, but rather like a sorting system that we use.
And that's kind of what we were talking about, is like at some point, like somebody drew a line between something that we were saying, okay, this is Australopithecus and this one is genus Homo. And initially that line was tool use. So mm-hmm. Homo Habilis is the tool-using man, is like what his sort of pop culture-y name was. Mm-hmm. But one of the big things that Jane Goodall discovered when she was first doing her research out in Gombe was that chimps also use tools. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that chimps use tools really changed the definition for what we consider human, and we really haven't settled on one. It's been 60 years almost since she observed chimps using tools, and people are still arguing about like how we decide what goes in genus Homo now. Like I said, Homo habilis has been a deeply controversial species ever since. Because there's, like I said, biologically, like you go back and you look at the anatomy of it, because we obviously can't do, it's stuff that's old enough that you can't do like genetic similarity testing with it, so you end up basing everything based on just like bone morphology, basically, because that's all you got. And you look at that and compare, Homo habilis to, like I said, some of the late Australopithecines, and there's really no reason to separate them into two separate genuses. Like I said, initially when the Homo habilis remains were discovered, they found tools with it, and that was the thing. That they're like, aha, this is our line, we're going to use that. Is
there some sort of phylogenetic criteria that we could use nowadays with modern computational genetics techniques?
I haven't heard of it, but I'm also not on the bleeding edge of this exactly anymore. But I would bet probably. But the question is then, like, even if they do something like that, build, like I said, a computational model for how we're deciding this. It's a whole different question of actually of coming up with an answer and then actually getting people to buy into it and start using it.
Even if you could, it might just go onto the pile of models for defining humans.
Because, like we were talking about a little bit too, people's legacies get tied up into this stuff. Like if you're the guy, or you're the son of the guy or daughter of the guy who discovered Homo habilis, you want Homo habilis to stay in genus Homo, because that gets considered to be a much bigger, more relevant discovery than Australopithecus habilis does. Yeah. And I said it's an interesting thing. I said especially when, and again, kind of getting into the behind the curtain sort of politics of this, a lot of this stuff is all tied up in one family, basically, that controls a lot of the the paleontology sites in Africa. This family called the Leakeys, that Jane Goodall is also sort of affiliated with here, has control of a lot of these sites, and as such has control of access to a lot of these materials.
And thus the definitions.
And thus the definitions of them. And so particularly, Jane Goodall is affiliated with Louis Leakey. Louis? Yeah. Louis. Yeah, Louis is the one that she was working under. And so there's a whole family of Leakeys. There's Mary and Richard that are all very prominent, paleoarchaeologists. And so, like I said, she got access to Gombe and to these chimps, basically via connections with Louis Leakey. And Louis Leakey is, again, kind of an interesting figure when it comes to anthropology. He was kind of the patriarch of the Leakey family in like the mid-1900s when, Jane Goodall was first being sent out to Africa. He's been dead for decades at this point, but and so what's kind of interesting is Jane Goodall was somebody who, when she first went out to Gombe, when she first got sent out to do research, she really didn't have much as far as qualifications. Like Jane Goodall didn't go out to Gombe with a PhD. She might, I don't even know if she had her bachelor's.
I think she had an undergrad, I think.
And
that might have been it.
But yeah, it's interesting because like she initially, because I know they had to like fight with the government to let her get out there on her own, and like initially she wasn't out there, you know, officially doing her own research. She was Louis Leakey's assistant.
Right, and it's because on top of being underqualified, being a woman in that time would have been difficult.
And you know, she was like 22, like
a young woman,
a young woman that they were sending out to Tanzania to do direct hands-on like research with these chimpanzees. And so basically what happened, and this happened within like a couple years of each other, was Louis Leakey decided to kind of take, because the Leakey family had been existing for a while and been prominent for a while, and so what he decided he wanted to do is sort of take this family's prominence in the like paleoarchaeology space, paleoanthropology space, and use that to sort of be an advocate for conservation work of modern great apes. And so what he decided to do was he wanted to, you know, have some highly publicized researchers out there working with the three great apes. So he sent Jane Goodall out to work with chimpanzees. He sent Diane Fossey out to work with gorillas. And he sent a woman named Ruti Galtakos out to work with orangutans. And this is kind of where I want to start getting into sort of part two of this discussion here, where there's a very, especially early on, a lot of the research Jane Goodall was doing was very, very controversial for her methodology. She's kind of to a point where she's prominent enough now that people tend to like not question the stuff she does or did. But at the time when she was first starting out, people were very critical of her research, and a big part of it was people were accusing her of personifying or you know, anthropomorphizing. Thank you. That's the word I'm trying to use. Anthropomorphizing the chimps. And so she was doing things that were not typical of researchers at the time doing research on animals. Like she gave them names, for example. At the time, the standard practice was you assigned your chimps numbers. Or not just chimps, any animal population you were doing, you gave them numbers. And so a lot of her early research was very heavily criticized because there was this assumption that she was attributing human characteristics to them that they probably weren't actually exhibiting. There was also a lot of controversy with her as far as doing things like setting up feeding stations with chimps, and so the accusation there was that she was changing the behaviors that the chimps were exhibiting by setting up these big stations where there was a bunch of food. And so a lot of the stuff that she observed about sort of the interpersonal conflicts between the chimps ended up happening sort of around these feeding stations that she was putting out. And so a lot of her contemporaries were like, well, you're observing these behaviors, but you're also creating an unnatural situation and then observing behaviors that also aren't natural because of it.
Which is interesting because nowadays in ethology, environmental manipulation is like one of the most common types of experiment. So that must have been a change.
Yeah, and like I said, she I don't know if it's necessarily a change, but it's more, I think, a matter of what was controversial at the time was, like I said, you'll do environmental manipulation stuff now and a lot of ecology stuff, but that's like the point of the experiment a lot of the time. Yeah. Whereas she was doing a thing, like not necessarily accounting for it as a variable. She was doing it and then
I see.
was sort of the accusation of it. I haven't read Jane Goodall's papers, like I can't speak to that, but she's a figure who, like, to this day has a certain contingent of anthropologists who like don't think super highly of her research. And it brings up sort of an interesting thing, and Diane Fossey very much gets into this too, is a lot of the kind of other part of this is sort of the question of, along with that sort of anthropomorphizing end of it, there's the question of, as a scientist, as a researcher of anything, any group, is it right to also be like an advocate for that group. Like I said, her initial thing that she got put out there to do was, you know, be photographed with chimps for National Geographic. And she does some research and publishes things while she's out there of the observations she makes. But she was put out there less to be a scientist per se than she was to like be someone who could be an advocate for these animals. And so that then called into question sort of the reliability of the information she was putting out, because she was there as an advocate kind of first and foremost. And Diane Fossey very much got tied up in this too. Diane Fossey was studying gorillas and very much got tied down into the like local politics in was it Congo or Uganda where she was? I don't remember. To the point where it's officially a mystery what happened to her, but she got killed by poachers is what happened to Diane Fossey. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie Gorillas in the Mist, that's about Diane Fossey. But yeah, she got to a point where she pretty much wasn't publishing things like hardly at all about the actual gorillas. She was just out there as a anti-poaching advocate, basically. Them, really. But still sort of gets in a lot of ways framed as a scientist. So you have this kind of tug of war back and forth of, you know, are you a scientist? Are you a naturalist, like advocate person? And if you're trying to be this naturalist, this, you know, advocate for this species, can we trust the research you're putting out? Because you have an agenda here that you're being open with.
And one of the issues, though, I suppose, is that, you know, going back to the idea of the definition of a human, if chimps are so similar to us that there is a question that they could be something like Homo troglodytes, or like you said, Australopithecus, was that what it was? Australopithecus troglodytes, then is it necessarily unreasonable to anthropomorphize them somewhat, because they are human-like?
And that's,
you know?
that's a big part of like what Jane Goodall's argument was you're assuming that I am anthropomorphizing these things. You're assuming that I'm the one who's attributing these traits to them rather than that they just actually have these traits.
Yeah, right.
And like I said, because a big part of this initial kind of thing is that they hadn't been observed much at that point. Like there hadn't been somebody doing what Jane Goodall was doing, where it's like, yeah, you're just going to live with these chimps for years and just like see what they do. Like that hadn't happened before. And so she, of course, was observing a lot of behaviors that had not previously really been observed.
Yeah.
And like I said, because she was out there sort of as, like I said, this advocate, and because she was doing the things like the naming, people saw this other thing that she was doing of observing all these behaviors and sort of attributing personalities to these animals and saying, oh, this is just you making up more stuff, kind of.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that's sort of an issue in especially ecology and ethology type research, is that people, I think a lot of researchers view themselves as sort of like somehow disparate from the environment that they're studying, but a lot of times your presence in an environment is directly going to interact and affect behavior, even if you don't even realize it, even if you think you are hiding or you are in some way disconnected. I think that animals behave differently in reaction to humans than they would otherwise.
Yeah, and the type of stuff that you're talking about now is like very, very much a like graduate school topic, is the idea of, you know, recognizing yourself as a variable in any given experiment, whether that be the effect that your presence is having, whether that be biases that are built into your experiment that you design that you're probably not even accounting for, whether that be biases in the interpretation of your data that you're not even accounting for. And the whole idea of the peer review system is supposed to mitigate this somewhat, but you can't eliminate bias. It's impossible. Like every single statement that every single person makes, every single experiment that every single person designs has bias built into it. It's impossible to negate it. It's impossible to fully get rid of it. And so there's a lot of like modern, if you're like going into master's degree, PhD program, a lot of that is being like, hey, if you're going to be a good scientist, you like gotta come to terms with the fact that you have biases.
Yeah.
And understand as best you can what your biases are so that you can do the best job you can to mitigate them.
Totally.
And accepting that you're never going to fully do it. You're not going to get rid of them. But if you understand on some level what they are, you can do better.
Yeah. I mean, the human experience is sort of inherently subjective. It's impossible to achieve, like, true objectivity because you're always going to leave some trace of your, like you said, like your biases in your work. Yep. There's just no way to avoid it.
I said, and even once you get, the peer review system, like, a group of people is still going to have its biases. Like, even if it's not just you, like, you can pull 30 other scientists in, and there's still going to be some shared biases among those 30 other scientists.
Because a lot of times you're trained in the same systems. A lot of times you even have the same professors or mentors that are leading you, or you're operating in the same labs. The culture across labs a lot of times becomes sort of intentionally stereotyped, maybe to try and maximize similarities between testing environments.
Yeah,
but
it has its benefit in that it reduces variables, basically. Like, if everyone's trained in the same way to do the same things, then your experiments, like I said, inherently are going to have fewer variables because the mistakes are all going to be the same too.
But it just means you can have a collective like research group blind spot that nobody even sees. I wish I could think of a more concrete example of it.
But I want to talk about the last one of the 3 great ape people, the 3 women that got sent out to study great apes, Brutigallticos. And Brutigallticos is interesting in that she is undoubtedly the least famous of Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Brutigallticos. She's like the one that people haven't heard of. But she is also like far and away, like within the scientific community, like the most respected. Like, she has published more papers than Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey have combined, probably 10 times over. And like I said, is pretty much universally respected as like the world's leading authority on orangutans, and is like still doing research to this day. She's like 80 and she's still out there. So shout outs to her. And like one of the things with her is like she does do like some advocacy work, but she is the one who, she's, I think incidentally, also the only one who got sent out there with a graduate degree already. I think she had her master's when she went out, and Diane Fossey, Dan Fossey and Jane Goodall maybe had bachelors. One of them might not have had their bachelors even.
Really?
But Brutigallticos like was, a biologist. He was somebody with like a graduate degree who got sent out there to do research. And like I said, has had, her hiccups as far as like, having to deal with the Indonesian government and the Bornean government. But she's been out there for, again, 50 plus years, and pretty much everything we know about orangutans we know because of Brutigallticos. Like, she is the body of knowledge on orangutans. Like,
and you were right about Jane Goodall. She didn't even have a bachelor's when she went out there. She entered a doctoral program without a bachelor's degree.
Yeah. She's it's not like an honorary one that she got,
no,
right?
It's a real doctoral degree. It's not very common at all. I think you have to get specifically recommended by a professor. Yeah,
which, like, when you're Jane Goodall, like...
This was early 1962, so this is, I mean, some professor, I didn't look deep enough to say
when you're tight with Louis Leakey, like, you can do that.
I think it was Louis Leakey who advocated for her.
Yeah. But yeah, and it's interesting because, like I said, Brutigallticos much more respected as a scientist, like I said, kind of universally than Jane Goodall is or Diane Fossey is, but probably as a byproduct of that, of being somebody who has really committed herself to being further on that scientist side of the spectrum versus that advocate side of the spectrum, has ended up being a lot less famous personally, and arguably has done less as far as like conservation efforts for her ape that she studies than the other two have accomplished. Like, Jane Goodall has become like a mascot worldwide for conservation work. Like, Jane Goodall has...
She's like synonymous with conservation.
Yeah, has done more for chimpanzee populations than any, quote unquote, real scientist ever has. Yeah. And probably ever will.
And to be honest, I think
there's some scientists that are, not thrilled about like the fact that she gets branded as a scientist rather than as, you know, kind of an advocate person. You know, it's a weird, interesting thing that, you know, gets into some weird interpersonal stuff within anthropology circles. That it's it's weird. People are people, or are they?
And right. That's a good way to tie it up. I guess I'll say is that I think that there's a large amount of value to be found in both looser advocacy work as well as like sort of more regimented theory.
Yeah, and I don't. It doesn't seem like, from what I've experienced, it doesn't seem like there's people who are like Jane Goodall bad. Really, it's more people who are like, she's not a very good scientist, and people aren't thrilled with the idea that like she gets fronted as like a scientist doing scientific research when, like I said, her research methods have always been kind of and she hasn't been publishing stuff in like decades, and when she did publish, she didn't publish much.
Yeah.
Like,
it all just depends.
Being a scientist within academia is built around publishing.
Yeah.
Like, you get in a room with a bunch of PhDs, and when they're trying to like show off to each other, what they're saying is how many times they've been published or how many times they've been cited by other publications,
or what journals they've been published in, or
and Jane Goodall doesn't have a very impressive resume on that end relative to how famous she is. Is kind of the takeaway on that end of things. But like I said, she's made a bigger impact on the world than any biologist in the last 100 years, probably.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, before her, what, Darwin?
Yeah.
You know? Anyway.
But yeah, so that's that. It's a little bit of a weird time today because we've been busy the last few days, so hope you guys enjoy the After Hours show. Get a little taste of HSC nights, or maybe we're talking about a little bit more controversial topics.
Yeah,
who knows?
I kind of like that. It's fun.
But thank you guys for watching. The Headwaters Science Center is open 9:30 to 5, Monday through Saturday. We're open from 1 to 5 on Sunday, so swing by and visit any of those times. We'll be doing another live show tomorrow at 3:30, so it's Wednesday, so Lee's going to be reading a book. It's going to be about, I think, like electricity stuff is, I think, what he's doing, is what I heard. And then this coming Friday is normally my show, but actually we're going to have a guest presenter on Friday who is going to be still doing like a follow-up show for Lee, but it's not going to be me on camera on Friday. It's going to be somebody else. So we will see you Wednesday and Friday, hopefully. And yeah, swing by and visit anytime we're open. And if you come by at 3:30 or, you know, kind of just whenever we're shooting, you're welcome to come out and watch. We don't have an audience right now because we're closed. But sometimes we have an audience for these shows, and sometimes it's kind of fun to have an audience for these shows to, you know, get a little respond, react to. I love my internet audience, but it's hard to talk to you guys.